All right, welcome back, everyone. Have you ever thought about, how much more there is to the story of Snow White?
Absolutely, yeah.
Like more than what you see on the surface. Well, today, we're doing a deep dive into the original Grimm Brothers version.
Ooh.
And we're going to be talking about some, seriously interesting stuff about its cultural impact and how it shaped how we think
Yes.
about things.
Yeah.
So get ready to uncover some really surprising symbolism. We're talking apples,
Of course, yeah.
mirrors. This is not just a children's story, folks.
Right. This is one of those tales that, it's deceptively simple, right?
Yeah.
It seems like a children's story. And on the surface, it is, but boy, the layers of meaning underneath that are just incredible.
Exactly. It's one of those stories that you hear as a kid and you're like, oh, Snow White's pretty and the queen's evil and,
Right.
the prince saves the day. But then as you get older,
Yeah.
you start to pick up on all these different themes and nuances.
Yeah.
And you're like, oh, there's a lot more going on here.
Way more going on.
Oh, than I realized. So, okay, before we get into all that deep stuff, let's do a quick recap of the story for anyone who might need a refresher.
Yes, a little Snow White 101.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So we've got Snow White. She's, beautiful, innocent. She's got this evil stepmother.
Yeah.
The queen who is obsessed with being the fairest of them all.
Right. Classic villain.
Totally. And of course, the queen has that magic mirror.
The magic mirror. Yeah.
Always asking, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest of them all?
And setting us up for trouble every time.
Exactly. So the queen gets jealous of Snow White's beauty, obviously, and orders a huntsman to,
To get rid of her.
to get rid of her. But the huntsman, he takes pity on Snow White and lets her go. She ends up finding her way to the forest and stumbles upon, of course,
The dwarfs.
the 7 dwarfs.
7 dwarfs living their best life.
Yeah, living in their cozy little cottage.
Yeah.
And she, keeps house for them, becomes part of their little family.
A little found family, yeah.
But the queen, she's not giving up that easily. She finds out Snow White is still alive, and she's like, all right, fine, I'll take care of this myself. And she disguises herself, goes to the cottage, and tricks Snow White with that.
That infamous apple. Uh-huh.
Yes, the poisoned apple. And of course, Snow White takes a bite and falls into a deep sleep.
The classic sleeping curse.
Right. And everyone thinks she's dead. And that brings us to, the prince comes along, sees her lying there, gives her true love's kiss.
The Disney version.
The Disney version, yeah. And she wakes up and they live happily ever after.
Oh, there you go. The abridged version.
Yeah, the super short version. But now let's dive into what all of that really means, because there's so much symbolism packed into this story.
Right. It's like an iceberg, right? You see this little tip of the iceberg above the water, but underneath there's this huge mass of meaning.
Exactly. So let's start with that poisoned apple.
Okay, yeah, good place to start.
Because it's not just any apple, right?
Yeah.
It's this really loaded symbol.
Oh, it's so loaded. Think about what the apple represents throughout history and literature. Temptation, forbidden knowledge, the loss of innocence.
Especially in the, the Garden of Eden story, right?
Exactly. That's the classic example. The apple as this kind of gateway to a more adult understanding of the world with both its pleasures and its dangers.
And so in Snow White, when she takes that bite, it's almost like she's taking a bite out of, the complexities of adulthood.
Exactly.
And all the good and bad that comes with it.
And the choices, right? It's the choice to kind of step out of that naive innocence and into a world where there's deception, there's danger.
Yeah, because before that, she's kind of living in this, sheltered little world with the dwarfs.
Right.
Everything's safe and happy. But that apple, it's like a wake-up call to the reality that, the world isn't always like that.
Yeah, and it raises this interesting question, right? Was she punished for taking that bite? Was she punished for wanting more? Was she punished for being curious? These are questions that we still grapple with today.
Oh, totally. Especially for women, right? Is a woman's curiosity or ambition a good thing or a bad thing? Is it something to be celebrated or feared?
Right. Is she a temptress or is she just trying to learn and grow?
Exactly. And you see these themes playing out, all over the place, not just in fairy tales, but in movies, books, real life, everywhere.
Oh, absolutely. It's a timeless theme that we keep coming back to because I think it taps into some really deep-seated anxieties about, women and power and knowledge.
Yeah, for sure. And speaking of anxieties, we can't talk about Snow White without talking about the queen and her whole obsession with beauty.
Oh, yeah, the queen. She's the ultimate embodiment of vanity, right?
Totally. And, it's kind of sad, right? She's so consumed by her appearance, always worried about someone being fairer than her.
Right. She's trapped in this cycle of comparison.
Yeah. And that magic mirror, it's almost like the original Instagram filter or something.
It is, right. It's this constant reminder of, how she measures up against some arbitrary standard of beauty.
And it's never enough, right? Like, no matter how fair she is, there's always this fear that someone else will be fair.
Exactly. She's never satisfied. And it really speaks to the pressure that women especially feel to conform to these, like, often unattainable beauty standards.
Oh, yeah. And it's not just women, right? Like, everyone feels the pressure to look a certain way.
Yeah. But historically, I think it's been particularly intense for women.
Yeah, definitely. And the crazy thing is that pressure, it's everywhere, right? Like, it's in magazines, it's on TV, it's on social media, it's
inescapable.
It really is. It's like this constant message that your worth is tied to how you look.
Right. And it can be so damaging. I mean, it can lead to, eating disorders, body dysmorphia, all sorts of problems.
Totally. And I think it's important to remember that, like, beauty, it's subjective, right? Like, what one person finds beautiful, another person might not.
Exactly. There's no one standard of beauty.
Yeah, and I think the story of Snow White actually kind of highlights that, because you've got the queen who's obsessed with this, like, very specific, conventional idea of beauty.
Right.
But then you got Snow White, who's also considered beautiful. But it's more about her innocence and kindness.
Right. Exactly. It's her inner beauty that shines through.
Yeah. And so it's like the story is contrasting these two different ideas of what makes someone beautiful.
Yeah, and it's asking us to consider, like, what's really more important, Is it outer beauty or inner beauty?
Right, exactly. Because, I mean, the queen, she might be the fairest in terms of looks, but she's clearly not a good person.
No, she's driven by jealousy and hatred.
Yeah. And Snow White, she might not be perfect, but she's kind and compassionate.
Right, and she's resilient. I mean, think about what she goes through.
I know, right? Like, she's basically forced to grow up overnight.
Exactly. She gets thrown out into the world, has to fend for herself. She's surrounded by these strange little men.
Yeah, it's like a crash course in adulthood.
It really is. And she handles it all with grace and, like you said, resilience.
Yeah, and I think that's something that a lot of people can relate to, Like, we all go through those periods where we're forced to grow up and figure things out on our own.
Absolutely. It's a universal experience.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why the story of Snow White has resonated with people for so long, Because it's not just a fairy tale, it's about these very real human experiences that we all go through.
Right. It's a story about growing up, about facing challenges, about figuring out who you are in the world.
Exactly. And it's interesting, because there are so many different versions of Snow White from all over the world.
Oh, absolutely. It's a story that's been told and retold across cultures and time periods.
Yeah. I mean, you've got the Grimm brothers version, which is the one we're most familiar with, but there are versions from, like, Italy, France, China, Japan.
All over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And each version has its own unique twist, reflecting the culture and values of the people who told it.
Right, and that's what makes it so fascinating to compare them, because you can see how different cultures grapple with similar themes.
Totally. Like, for example, I was reading about the Japanese version of Snow White.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it's called Yuki Onna, which means snow woman.
Okay.
And she's kind of like a spirit of the snow, this beautiful, ethereal being.
Okay.
And her story is a little bit different from the Grimm brothers version.
How so?
Well, for one thing, she's not really a victim, She's more like a force of nature, this powerful being who can be both benevolent and dangerous.
Interesting.
Yeah. And her story often explores themes of duty and acceptance of fate, which are very important in Japanese culture.
Right. It's like the same basic elements, but they're filtered through this, like, distinctly Japanese lens.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show how, these fairy tales, they're not static.
Right.
They evolve and change over time, reflecting the beliefs and values of the people who tell them.
And that's one of the things that makes them so powerful, right? Because they can speak to us on so many different levels.
Totally. And speaking of powerful, we can't forget about the impact that Disney had on the story of Snow White.
Oh, yeah. I mean, the 1937 Disney film, it's iconic.
It really is. It's like the version of Snow White that most people know.
Right.
And it's definitely shaped how we see the story, like those images of Snow White with her, big eyes and rosy cheeks, and the evil queen with her, pointy hat and the magic mirror.
Those are seared into our collective consciousness.
They really are. And I think it's interesting to think about how the Disney version, like, softened some of the darker elements of the original story.
Yeah, it's definitely a more sanitized version.
Yeah. Like, for example, in the Grimm brothers version, the queen actually forces Snow White to dance in red-hot iron shoes until she dies.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's a bit more intense.
Yeah, and that's not in the Disney movie, obviously.
Yeah, right, right. They tone things down a bit for the kiddos.
Yeah, and I mean, I get it. You know, it's a kid's movie. But I think it's important to acknowledge that the Disney version is just one interpretation of the story.
Absolutely. It's one particular lens through which we're seeing this tale.
Yeah, and it's a lens that's influenced by, Disney's own values and aesthetics.
Right. And those values and aesthetics have had a huge impact on our culture.
Totally. I mean, think about all the Disney princesses,
Yeah.
They've all got this certain look.
Right, they've got that Disney-fied look.
Yeah, and it's not just the princesses, it's the villains too,
Yeah.
Like the evil queen in Snow White, she's become this archetype of the wicked stepmother.
Right, and it's interesting how that archetype has been perpetuated in other stories and media.
Yeah, and it makes you wonder, like how much of our own understanding of beauty and good and evil has been shaped by these Disney images.
It's a lot to think about, right?
It really is, and it's not just Disney, right? There are all these modern retellings of Snow White too.
Yeah, there's tons of them.
Like movies, TV shows, video games, even.
Yeah, she's everywhere.
And some of them are pretty dark and twisted,
Right, right. They're going back to those darker roots of the fairy tale.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, like, why are we still so fascinated by this story? Why do we keep retelling it and reimagining it?
Well, I think it's because the story of Snow White, it speaks to some really deep-seated human anxieties and desires,
Yeah.
Like the fear of aging, the desire for beauty and love, the struggle between good and evil.
Right. And those themes, they're timeless.
They are, and I think that's why Snow White continues to resonate with us, even centuries after the original story was written.
Yeah. And I think that the different retellings, they allow us to explore those themes in new ways, Like, they reflect the anxieties and concerns of our own time.
Right, so like a modern retelling of Snow White might focus on themes of female empowerment or the dangers of social media or something like that.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes it so interesting to look at all these different versions side by side. You can really see how the story has evolved over time and how it continues to reflect our changing values and beliefs.
Yeah, it's like a mirror in a way, reflecting back to us who we are and what we care about.
Exactly. And it makes you wonder, like, what will future retellings of Snow White look like?
Right, what will they say about us?
Yeah, that's something to think about, right? So the next time you see Snow White, whether it's the Disney version or a more modern take, remember that there's always more to the story than meets the eye.
Absolutely. Dig a little deeper, you might be surprised by what you find.
Exactly. And with that, we'll wrap up our deep dive into Snow White. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, it's been fun.
Yeah, it has. And until next time, keep exploring those fairy tales and all the hidden meanings within them.
And keep an eye out for those apples, folks. You never know what they might symbolize.
Exactly. See you next time.
See ya.